Well, actually,
Let me just tell
Part of the colonial, did you say something like that?
No,
Because
then say Germany was not
Yeah.
here, but certainly, yeah. They were even.
folks, welcome to today's Brownbag. We're certainly glad to see you. It looks like we got some new faces here. So we do this every Tuesday Tuesday at noon. And if you're interested in what else we've got going on this semester, we've got event listings over here. The only other element that we've got related to Crease that's going on later on in the week is on Friday, October 5th, the Czech and Slovak Club of Kansas City is sponsoring an event called Dissident Statesman, a celebration of Václav Havel. That's going to be happening up at the Kansas City Public Library in Rome. Nathan Wood is going to be doing an intro on the political and other elements
kind
of
of a
his legacy.
biography of Havel to introduce the play audience.
So that starts at 6 o'clock. They're actually going to have snacks, hors d'oeuvres to start with, as well as Czech beers and wine. And it's a multi-stage event. They're going to do several different lecture type things, as well as do a short play of this. So, today we have Erik Scott, who is relatively new to KU, but we welcome him. He's faculty. He is here from his PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and then most recently served as a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C. His research interests include migration, empire, ethnicity, everyday life, and economic crime. And we didn't plan this really to coincide to be such a timely topic, but he's going to be speaking on exotic entrepreneurs, Georgian trade networks, and the tensions of Soviet empire.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for coming today. Thank you, Chris, for having me. The timing is really fortuitous in the sense that we're one day after a very historic election in Georgia, the first peaceful transfer of power through elections in the nation's history. And although I haven't had much time to prepare, I was up last night until about midnight checking the poll returns. I will be happy to say a few words about that at the end, and I'll actually, one of the main players that's emerged out of this comes in part from this tradition of Georgian trade networks and Georgian entrepreneurs in Russia. So I want to go back to the 1960s and 1970s when there were literally dozens of anecdotes or jokes told about Georgian market traders in the Soviet Union. And a lot of these, you really have to understand the context for them to be funny, but one of them has to do with a Georgian who's on an Aeroflot flight bound for Moscow. That ends up being hijacked 3 times. The first hijacker comes in with one gun and demands that the plane go to London. The second hijacker comes in with 2 guns and demands that the plane change route to Paris. The plane changes route. Finally, the Georgian comes in with a bomb and angrily demands the plane turn back to Moscow. So the plane lands in Moscow. The 2 first hijackers are, of course, carted off to jail, and the Georgian is congratulated by a group of Soviet officials who are very happy that he's turned the plane back, but they're also a little puzzled, why Moscow and not Paris. To which he replies, "What was I going to do with 5,000 carnations in Paris?" So the joke, which again might not make a lot of sense today, was funny because it alluded to several important dimensions of the Georgian and Soviet context. First of all, Georgian trading occurred in a relatively closed society whose command economy created somewhat strange incentives for money making based on the sale of prosaic goods like carnations. Second, because of Georgian success in this trading, Moscow may have been the capital of a repressive imperial state, but it was also a city of great opportunity. Third, and perhaps less obviously, Soviet officials often turned a blind eye to some of the more illicit forms of Georgian economic activity. Remember that the hijacker, despite having a bomb, is congratulated by authorities while the other 2 are sent to jail. These flowers, these carnations, weren't simply a insignificant thing. Actually, they were one of many rare commodities that the Georgians traded in. And so Georgians provided not only most of the obligatory flowers that Soviets needed for holidays and dates and when they went to people's houses, they also provided a range of other scarce and sometimes exotic goods that were crucial for Soviet social rituals. Georgia produced 95% of the tea grown in the Soviet Union, and if you've been to Russia or anywhere else in the region, you know how important tea is and how often it's drunk. Georgia grew and sold most of the tobacco that accompanied tea breaks. Georgia cultivated 90% of the citrus fruits that Soviets hoped for their New Year's tables. Soviets toasted with Georgian wine, and they praised the Georgian mineral water Borjomi, which has reputedly many health benefits, not least of which is serving as the antidote for too much Georgian wine. So this period is often thought of or written of as a time of zastoy or stagnation, but I think a closer look reveals that even as the official economy was stagnating, an informal second economy was booming, rising up to meet the demand for consumer goods like these. And in the interest of accommodating a Soviet population that was now more urban than ever, the state grew more tolerant of small-scale market trading, while relying on the KGB to prosecute larger-scale cases and larger-scale operations. The recently declassified files of the Georgian KGB, which I'll be drawing on in my talk today, offer, I think, a rare view into the operation of some of these informal Georgian networks and their interaction with the state. Now, generally speaking, this burgeoning Soviet marketplace was dominated by non-Russians, or at least disproportionately so. Diaspora networks that were bound by trust proved most effective in obtaining goods and enforcing contracts in the absence of legal regulation. So the Georgians were not alone. There were Azeris in fruit and vegetable markets, Armenians in key positions as middlemen minorities, Chechens with a reputation for violent contract enforcement. The ethnic nature of the Soviet second economy played on reputed stereotypes and exaggerations of real cultural differences. But I would argue that a reputation for being able to obtain rare goods, or even for having a propensity to violence, could itself be a form of capital. Before going any further, I just want to say a few words about how today's presentation fits into my larger project. Can everyone see this okay? So this is how we typically think of the Soviet Union, as a multi-ethnic state divided into constituent and separate national republics. But this map of Soviet nationalities shows that national groups and national cultures were by no means confined to their titular republics. They instead traveled throughout the Soviet Union. And this map actually only shows residents. There was a whole lot of traveling, sojourning, temporary residents and residents that was not reported going on as well. So Georgians traveled beyond Georgia, Armenians beyond Armenia, Ukrainians beyond Ukraine, Uzbeks beyond the Uzbek Republic, and so on. While historians have typically emphasized the sealed nature of external Soviet borders, these relatively closed borders hid an incredible mobility of internal populations. And the infrastructure of the Soviet Union made possible new forms of migration and exchange. I look at these groups living beyond their national republics as internal diasporas with a homeland and a host society in one state. And the book I'm currently in the process of writing explores the broader significance of these internal diasporas. And I argue that when we think of their importance in economics and politics and culture and society, we should think of the Soviet Union really as an empire of diasporas, not simply as a Russian-dominated state, but as a place where, even in everyday life, the mixing of a diverse array of mobile nationalities was something apparent, palpable, and noticeable, and often celebrated. To take the argument one step further, this Soviet Union was not only an empire of diasporas, but also an empire of internally produced commodities, whose circulation was often linked to specific diaspora networks. Since unlike classical diasporas, these groups like the Georgians had a homeland and a host society in one state, Georgian networks could easily connect producers in the Caucasus down here with consumers in Moscow and elsewhere throughout the Soviet Union. My talk today, I'll focus on the economic dimensions of my project. looking at the economic role of the Georgian diaspora at a time when it came to the forefront of Soviet life in the Brezhnev era. I'll begin by discussing what it was that made the Georgians so successful in the Soviet context, and then I'll examine a few cases in detail to give you a better sense of how Georgian trade networks operated. And in conclusion, I'll say a few words about the implications of Georgian success both for the Soviet Empire and for contemporary Russia. So what was it that made Georgians so successful as Soviet entrepreneurs? This slide, which you can't see very well because of the light, points to climate. And I think it's fairly easy to attribute Georgian success to climate alone, given the fact that Georgia was one of the few places where things like flowers, tea, tobacco, and oranges could be grown within Soviet borders. And this was especially true along the celebrated Black Sea coast of Georgia, which you can see here. Climate is what Nikita Khrushchev had in mind in his memoirs when he complained about Georgians profiteering and speculating everywhere they go. Khrushchev went on to note, quote, "There are many temptations in Georgia for speculators. The climate is warm, there are many vineyards and other human delights." Explaining the prominence of Georgian traders in geographic rather than cultural terms, Khrushchev admitted, quote, "If Russians lived in Georgia, they would do exactly the same thing." Geography, of course, mattered, but so too did political climate. I'll show you one more. These are orange groves by the Black Sea to give you a sense of how different the climate is from Russia. But political climate also mattered too. By the Brezhnev era, unofficial economic enterprises operated in Georgia on a huge scale. And this was true throughout the Soviet Union, that there was unofficial economic enterprise, but perhaps nowhere was it operated so openly as it was in Georgia. Despite stagnant official incomes, by 1970, the size of the typical Georgian savings account was about twice that of the Soviet average. Police reports that I've looked at in the archive that were classified secretly complained about the Georgian public's toleration of the theft of state resources. They complain about the flagrant display of illicit gains in the form of big parties thrown at restaurants and lavish homes illegally constructed along the Black Sea. This is all in the 1960s and 1970s. Given this festive and somewhat freewheeling atmosphere of late Soviet Georgia, it's perhaps not surprising that another joke dating back to this period says that at the Tbilisi rail station, when the announcement came over the loudspeaker, they would announce trains leaving Tbilisi for the USSR. So the Georgians benefited from this climate, from this atmosphere of local corruption. But I would argue that the ability of these traders to market their goods beyond Georgia was also due to a distinctive cultural set of practices that were both strange and familiar in the Soviet context. On the one hand, Georgian traders made up a relatively exclusive community. They were bound by a distinct language that was practically indecipherable to outsiders. But on the other hand, and I can go into this more, and I do in my book, for reasons relating to Georgia's historical place in the Russian Empire and the early Soviet Union, Georgians were generally comfortable operating in a Russian environment. And their skill lay not only in their ethnic distinctiveness, but also in their ability to cross ethnic boundaries and make deals across ethnic boundaries and market their goods to Soviet consumers of all nationalities. As I'll try to show in the cases that follow, these entrepreneurs actually emphasized a familiar sort of strangeness to succeed in the Soviet marketplace. Drawing on a national cultural repertoire that was recognizable to most Soviets, they offered a more stylized version of blot, or the Russian practice of favor exchange. They trafficked in goods whose appeal lay not only in their scarcity, but also in their explicit branding as exotic Georgian products. And all the while, they maintained an uneasy but symbiotic relationship with the Soviet state. The authorities used, promoted, and sometimes resented Georgian success, while these Georgians negotiated between imperial prominence and local self-assertion. as I'll discuss at the end, all this has important implications for contemporary Russian-Georgian relations and the evolution of the post-Soviet marketplace. So I'd like to turn to three case studies to better illustrate how these traders employed familiarity and strangeness, how this played out, and how these operations evolved in the late Soviet period. For my first case, I'd like to return to the flowers that I started with. So like wine and tea, flowers were an officially sanctioned commodity, one that enjoyed state subsidies and access to official distribution channels. And these commodities like wine, tea, were also supported by an effective branding campaign that was designed by Georgians but sponsored by the Soviet state. This branding mixed familiarity and strangeness in equal parts. So in the case of Georgian wine bottles, we can see this bottle here, this combination of Russian and Georgian, the Georgian alphabet and motif here marking it as nationally distinct. Even though most Soviets could not read this here, where it says Georgian wine and Georgian, it was recognizable to most Soviets as Georgian script. It was also desirable because it marked it as authentic. Similarly, these boxes of Georgian tea offered an exoticism that was geared towards pan-Soviet consumption. So here again we can see the stylized Russian script evocative of the Georgian alphabet, scenes of the Georgian countries, Black Sea coast here, scenes of mountains, some of the subtropical flowers of the Black Sea coast. Again, evoking this national distinctiveness, evoking the Georgian brand. All these goods were linked in the minds of Soviet consumers to some of the official depictions of the Caucasus, and Georgian in particular as a subtropical paradise. This idea of a perpetually sunny Georgia was on display at the VDNH in Moscow, the all-union exhibition of economic achievements, which reproduced in miniature the economies, cultures, and peoples of the national republics. So here is the Georgian pavilion, one of the biggest, one of the first, and one of the most prominent in terms of its location. You can see this 18-foot Orientalist facade, the palm trees which were transported from Georgia to snowy Moscow. Enclosed within, if you walk within this, you'd find greenhouses with exotic flowers, tea plants, orange trees, grapevines. You even find real live Georgians who are serving wine, handing out cigarettes, Georgian dancers who perform not only some of the folk numbers that some of you might know, but also newer dances devoted to Soviet economic production. I actually haven't seen some of the economic dances. I looked in the archives. Some of the ones that were mentioned were the dance of taxi drivers, the dance of the flower children, the dance of the tea growers. I mean, I would really probably pay big money to see this just out of my own strange interest in these things. But these were the kinds of things that were on display at a pan-Soviet level. And so Georgian trade networks profited from the symbolic value of these goods that was created, branded, and celebrated in official Soviet culture. But authorities could not always control the way that these goods were circulated. And so faced with official shortages of flowers in the 1960s, the authorities began to adopt a more lenient approach to some of the impromptu flower markets that were springing up in Moscow. And according to a classified 1967 report that I found in the archives, as soon as the Moscow City Soviet began allowing cultivators to sell flowers directly to Soviet consumers, Georgians came to dominate the flower market. And they sold flowers at 3 to 4 times the prices that they were supposed to sell them for. And while in theory these Georgians were supposed to be themselves flower cultivators, thereby eliminating the middleman that seemed to reap too much of capitalism, these reports said that these people were in fact persons of no specific occupation, who transported these large batches of flowers on back and forth flights between Tbilisi and Moscow. And this was not an isolated phenomenon. By the mid-1960s, these reports that I've looked at, internal police reports, have found that close to 25% of Georgia's able-bodied population by the late 1960s worked outside the official economy. On these visits that police would periodically undertake to collective farms, they would find unauthorized laborers working in the place of farmers, and farmers engaged in private trade in the place of farming. Even if they tried to address these issues, they were often stymied by the efforts of the local party leadership. In this specific case of the Moscow flower market, responses or letters sent from Moscow to the Georgian leadership resulted simply in the Georgian Council of Ministers suggesting the possibility of opening an official store in Moscow to sell Georgian flowers directly. And no evidence of prosecution that I could find. The second case that I want to look at focuses not only on the development of unauthorized trading in official goods, but also in entirely new consumer goods that were illicitly produced in Soviet Georgia. This you see by the early 1970s, in particular, when entrepreneurs in Georgia, who were known simply as businessmen or sakmasanabi in Georgian, set up a whole network of unofficial workshops where they used state resources to produce cheap consumer goods. And these entrepreneurs capitalized, again, on Georgia's reputation for producing rare commodities, trading in rare commodities, and they relied on some of the existing Georgian trade networks. So what were these goods that these underground entrepreneurs were trading in? Here we can see some of them from a police photo. Scarves, nylon bags. In the bottom right, I don't know if you can make it out, but there's a Wrigley's chewing gum that's probably a knockoff. And so these were the kind of goods that were produced out of state resources in Georgia. And the most famous of these so-called businessmen was Otar Lazishvili, who became a ruble millionaire by selling his goods throughout the Soviet Union. So in Georgia, he ran facilities, a whole network of workshops that produced unauthorized consumer goods. He was officially employed as the associate laboratory director at one of these factories. And then in Russia, he and his associates, his contacts, distributed his products on a widespread scale. And this scale was such that it really could not be easily concealed. He probably had little to worry about in Tbilisi because he engaged in neighborhood philanthropy, and he also had the support of this person, Vasily Mzhavanadze, the first party secretary of Georgia from the thaw period to 1972. And Lazishvili was particularly close to the first party secretary, and actually, as this case was investigated, was found to have given a number of gifts to his wife as well, as a way of cultivating this friendship. So here's Mzhavanadze in the early 1970s escorting Brezhnev around the Dinamo Tbilisi soccer stadium. Lazishvili's downfall then coincided with the downfall of Mzhavanadze in 1972, and the rise of a very ambitious young Georgian reformer named Eduard Shevardnadze, who was then the head of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. So looking at the report written by Shevardnadze to his superiors, we can see that he targeted probably the most prosaic in Lazishvili's line of cheap consumer goods, which were these easily transportable nylon bags. And I think the banality of this item speaks to some of the peculiarities of the Soviet second economy. These bags were only so wildly desired because the scarcity of official goods required Soviets to have a bag on hand anytime goods might become available. So if they saw a line, they would have their bag. They would be able to get as many goods as they could. And the same command economy that caused these official shortages also seemed unable to produce consumer goods like the bags themselves. So as Shevardnadze's investigation broadened, it's difficult to get at what kind of context Lazishvili had in Russia. The Russian KGB archives are still closed, but we do know that he was arrested in the outer office of the Prosecutor General of the USSR, probably suggesting that he had some allies in there that he thought would help him. And so he was arrested before he could go into the inner office by the KGB, which was then led by Yuri Andropov, probably avoiding a messy interagency struggle. And so these activities were reined in briefly under Shevardnadze, but we know later on they reemerged, and by 2003, Shevardnadze, then president of independent Georgia, was actually overthrown amidst charges of corruption himself. The last set of actors, the last set of trade networks I want to look at have to do with a slightly different element. Increasingly assertive Georgian organized crime networks. So Georgians were especially prevalent among the Soviet vori v zakonie, or thieves in law, who were crime bosses specializing in explicitly illegal activities, so not in the trade of official goods or the production of prosaic goods, but things like theft and racketeering. In the context of organized crime, Georgians once again employed strangeness and familiarity to gain prominence and success. They're more likely than their Russian counterparts, for example, to rely on ethnically exclusive kinship circles, yet they're also comfortable establishing connections with criminal networks outside of Georgia. They spoke Russian with outsiders, but they used these Georgian nicknames or nicknames that related to regional places in Georgia, perhaps as a way of playing up their national origins. And so the thieves in law were around for decades, but it was a group of Georgians who actually pushed the organization to get more involved in the official economy. And this occurred as the economy was liberalizing in the 1980s. And by the late 1980s, they had seized control of a good number of newly formed Soviet cooperatives, and they were well positioned to take advantage of the wave of privatization in the early 1990s. So what were the consequences of all these networks, this economic success? I think together the success of formal and informal economic enterprise by Georgian trade networks illustrates some of the opportunities and some of the tensions of Soviet empire. On the one hand, the Soviet Union offered a vast market to Georgian traders, and central authorities promoted official Georgian enterprises, and state policies gave Georgian producers a virtual monopoly on several key goods. On the other hand, Georgian trade networks were subject to prosecution if they got too big, too successful, or operated too openly. These trade networks were relied upon by Soviet consumers, but they also generated a good deal of popular resentment, many traces of which can be found in some of the Soviet-era jokes that I was referring to. In these jokes, Georgians came to stand in for a whole range of ethnically distinct traders, whether they were in reality Georgians, Armenians, or Azeris. On the Georgian side, there was also frustration. Frustration at some of the restrictions that the state placed on local economic enterprise, as well as on local cultural expression. In this context, stealing from the Soviet state was seen as corrupt, but not necessarily immoral. Certainly not all or even most Georgians were active participants in the kind of networks that I'm talking about here. And in fact, many Georgian intellectuals were appalled at the reputation their country was getting as a place for speculators. But Georgians involved in the informal economy, Georgian thieves in law, could still appeal to explicitly national standards of honor and morality, even as they flaunted Soviet legality. These networks, in many ways, helped bind the empire together, but they also ended up undermining central control. So very briefly, how how have these networks evolved since the collapse of the Soviet Empire? And what's the legacy of the Georgian Soviet era economic success, both in Russia and in Georgia? Probably most obviously, Georgian networks have lost the monopolies they once enjoyed on exotic and rare commodities. Russians and even Georgians now drink tea from Sri Lanka. I can tell you this is true even in the tea-growing heartland of western Georgia. Cheap consumer goods like these nylon bags are now bought from China, where we buy all of our cheap consumer goods as well. Specialized goods like Georgian wine and mineral water are still produced, but as you probably know, they're banned in Russia in punitive measures which are aimed specifically at addressing or punishing or targeting the Georgians for an economic specialization of theirs in Russian markets. There's still a good deal of petty trading in things like fruit, nuts, flowers, and remittances sent from Georgians working in Russia remain an important part of the Georgian economy. But in terms of their significance in the Russian economy, they're really quite marginal. Russian consumers now have alternatives, and Russian immigration policy limits the movement of Georgian traders who before could easily move back and forth. The continuing prominence among the thieves-in-law of Georgians is often commented on, but is of course more difficult to document. Their significance appears to have waned with the rise of state power in Russia under Putin and in Georgia under Saakashvili, but they're also no longer confined to the Soviet Union. They've turned up in places like Spain. I think it remains to be seen whether this thieves-in-law as a group still exists or will still exist, or become something of a relic of the Soviet past in a more globalized criminal marketplace. I think it's also important to remember that while these groups might capture the public imagination, oftentimes systemic and global factors are too easily blamed on so-called mafias controlling things and causing prices to go up. These newly transnational diasporas in Russia generate tensions in the marketplace where we've seen backlashes directed not just against Georgians but also against Chechens, Armenians, and others. But they also generate tension in Georgia itself. Saakashvili made a great effort to reach out to Russia, despite worsening Russian relations, to attract investment, intellectual capital, seeking the return of ballet dancers, opera singers, seeking the return of investors, specialists. But when Bidzina Ivanishvili, this Russian-Georgian oligarch who's now leads the dominant, what will soon be the dominant majority in the Georgian parliament as of last night. When he established his party in the native country, he was almost instantly attacked as a supposed head of a secret pro-Russian center. It's maybe the case that Ivanishvili's success yesterday shows that these accusations no longer resonate in Georgian society. But I think more generally, while Soviet diasporas, internal diasporas, could successfully navigate between imperial prominence and local self-assertion, the tension between loyalty to a foreign state and loyalty to one's homeland is often more difficult to navigate. Thank you.